So part of variables, we have some talk in regard to how to declare them and how to initialize the value. Let's have some talk in regard to that. As you see in this demonstration, you could initialize the variable when you declare them, but usually it's a good idea to declare all the variables at the top of the scope of the module or perhaps the function. In this scenario, we are declaring a variable as type integer. And as you see, new to VB.NET, you could initialize the value right there by the time you're declaring it. In this scenario, I'm declaring a variable as type integer and pass 21 to it, and then I declare another variable as type date, which is today. Again, the date is an old data type. Instead of that, you could go with perhaps double if you wanted to, but the storage is automatically become double anyway. So date is available, but the way that they're storing the data is as numeric, which is double. You could also declare an array, which we're going to talk about later on. You have perhaps an array declared as a fixed array as type integer that creates 13 elements. All arrays in Visual Basic.NET are 0 base. So there's no more option as option base 1. So you could start from array 1. Also, you could initialize the array right there. As you see here, we are basically providing 12 elements in here. As you see, this is a dynamic array that you could just specify the dimensions right there, or you could use the redim in order to declare the specific dimension array later on. Also, you could use the redim with preserve keyword in order to keep the existing array member available. In order to declare multiple variables, as I mentioned in VB 6.0, I and j would have resulted into variant, but x would have become integer. Here in VB.NET, all of them result into integer. These are some changes that we have from VB 6 to VB.NET. Also, as far as the variable scope, we have procedural scope. We had that in VB 6. Variable accessed through the entire procedure, but from another procedure you couldn't expose those variables. In VB.NET, still that's the fact. However, I've given you also a block scope. You have a for next block, if then else block. If you declare a variable in there, they're not going to be exposed. As you see here, this is a procedural level variable, and you could use that within the block variable. This is a block of for next. But here we are declaring a variable within the block imax. So imax here outside of the block will result into a compiler error. That means you cannot use this variable within the block outside of the loop. That means this is only available within this block, only and only within this block. You cannot use it anywhere else. Also, as far as the data structure, you could create your own data types. Before in VB6, you had the concept of type. You could define a type, but now that has changed to a structure. So you could create a structure, as you see here, and using the structure keyword, specifying a name for it, and then using the end structure, you could actually end the block of the structure and define your own data type. Part of the structure, not only you could declare variables, but also you could create your own sub-procedures in there. Let's pay attention to this demonstration for a second. If I switch back in here, part of the same exact information in there, let's go and get rid of some of this line of codes. I'm removing all my breakpoints. I like to go and define a structure in here. I call a structure, and I name it, for example, employee. As you see, right now it fails on me because it says you have to have at least one member variable in there. So let's go and specify, for example, a public name, let's say first name as a string. And as you see, by just defining one, that problem is gone away. Let's go declare another variable in there. Public last name, for example, as a string again. And public age, for example, as byte. As you see, this becomes a data type. This is structure. And I can use this within my procedures, or perhaps within the scope that I have, like a module scope, and declare a variable from it. For example, if I choose my name as a variable name, I can actually refer to the employee, and as you see, the employee object becomes basically a data type. So I can refer to my name and automatically get exposed to all the variable member within the employee, age, first name, and last name. Not to mention that a structure itself can also have a procedure, like for example, hire, let's go back here, hire, for example, And if I have like a higher subroutine part of this data type, I could also refer to that specific method programmatically. So a structure also gives me an object-oriented design, so you could reuse this particular data type over and over again. Now let's switch back in here and see we have other options part of the compiler. We have option explicit. That's the default. You can turn it off, but we don't recommend that because that prevents logical errors. Option explicit means that you have to declare a variable before using. Option strict enforces a strict type semantic and restricts implicit type conversion. You have to explicitly convert the type. That's also is pretty good by the time you want to make sure that you're passing a right data type from one object to the other. Late binding by means of object data type is not allowed. And of course, if you have a late binding, you cannot do it for basically the object data type. By default, this is off for backward compatibility. If you have pure native environment for Visual Studio.NET, you can turn that to be on. And of course, part of the option strict, if you select this option, then implicit binding type conversion, like for example, by the time you're converting integer to long, is allowed. And also implicit narrowing type conversion, such as like converting numeric string to an integer or long to an integer, will cause a compiler. So it is totally up to your design. How would you like to go about, setting this strict option on or off? By default is off, as we mentioned. Also, you have option base 1 is not supported anymore. All arrays must start at 0. As far as the assignment operators, you have the following operators. These are new operators that we have in VB.NET now. Very similar to the semantic of C++, as you know. That simplifies variable assignment operator. That, for example, this would be multiplication, this would be division, addition, and so forth. In this example, iResult plus equal to 25. That means the value of iResult would be added 25 to it and would be stored onto the same specific variable. So iResult equals to the existing value for iResult plus 25. Of course, you have other assignment operators available as well. I've already demonstrated some of this talk in here. Let's continue with the next section, which talks about functions, subroutines, and properties. Well, first of all, you have to define and declare procedures, and then after that, you can start calling them and take advantage of them. As far as the Visual Basic 6, if you remember, you had to go and specify parentheses when you were calling a subroutine or a procedure, and you were placing it in a right-hand side of a equal sign by the time you were declaring a variable. But in VB.NET, all calls to all sub-procedures and functions have to enclose parentheses. You cannot just omit them. You have to have them. And by default, VB.NET enclose the parentheses for you. In VB6, you must use the parentheses when using a return value of a function, but here you have to actually specify that no matter what. As far as passing arguments by ref or by value, as we talked about earlier, VB6 used by ref as a default mechanism. In VB.NET, we have by val as a default mechanism, so keep that in mind. You also had an optional arguments. In VB 6.0, you don't need to specify the default value for the optional parameter, but in VB.NET, you need to specify the default parameter because there is no concept of default properties or parameters. In VB6, you could use the isMissing function, and in VB.NET, that is not supported anymore. Let's pay attention to this demo. If I switch back in here, let's go and declare a sub procedure. For example, I go with sub, add, and I like to go and pass a couple of variables in there, like x as double, and y as double. Actually, let's change that to be a function procedure rather. And here, all I need to do, either use the add, which is the name of the function, and make that to be equivalent to x plus y, or you could use the return keyword and specify x plus y. Both of them are supported in VB.NET, but why return? Because return will return the value sooner to the calling procedure before the function is over. So that gives you a little bit more speed in regard to finishing up the task, perhaps. This is great by the time you're using asynchronous methodology. Anyhow, either or will work in here. And of course, now, if I wanted to use this function within one of my sub-procedures in there, let me go clean up some of these samples that I've already specified. We don't need them anymore. So here, if I wanted to, for example, call this function, as you see, add automatically provides x plus y. So I could pass a couple of variables in there and get the result back to a message box, for example. Let's talk about the optional keyword. As you recall, we could specify the optional keyword and have a variable to be defined as an optional. So in here, by the way, as you see, the by val has been automatically inserted in here. By the time that I wanted to pass my cursor somewhere else, automatically the compiler added that. I can actually use the optional keyword in here and specify z as double as a parameter. As you see, optional keyword specifies that you could use z on demand. That means if you don't pass z, that means you don't have a parameter. If you do pass it, it counts it as a parameter. And of course, if you do have optional z, then you have to specify the default value. Otherwise, it will fail on you. As you see, it's waiting for a default value to be inserted. So the default value, for example, I put 0. Now here, of course, part of the return environment, you have to include the z anyways. So that's why you need to have a default value. So in this scenario, as you see, by the time I'm going through calling this function, I have x, y, and within the brackets, as you see, I have an optional value of z. If I use it, it will accept it. If I don't use it, it will take the 0 value as a default. So you could take advantage of that and use it programmatically. So I just demonstrated the optional keyword here for you. Also, as far as the static function and the static sub, in VB 6.0 you could place a static in front of any function or sub procedure heading. In VB.NET, a static function and static subroutines are not supported anymore. In VB6, local variables in a static function or static subroutine return their values between multiple calls. In VB.NET, you must explicitly declare all the static variables by putting the static keyword in front of them. So for example, let's take a look at this specific demonstration. Let's get started with the controls. I like to add a new button in here, and part of the properties, I like to name this button to be, for example, call or count, for example. If I double click on this particular button, automatically jumps into the procedure handler, and here I can declare the variable called a static x as, for example, byte. And here all I need to do is specify x plus equal to, actually plus equal to 1. That will automatically increment it. If you don't use a static, as you know, if you use them, automatically reset the value of x to be 0. Let's go and run this application, and as you see, every single time, actually I have to have a mechanism in order to show information in there. Let's go back and change some of the code. I'm just going to put a comment in here for the message box, and of course here I also like to show the value of x. So let's go and run this again. As you see, if I click count, it shows 1. If I click count again, it shows 2. So the static variable automatically returns the value of the variable even though you're outside of the scope. If I replace this with them, x as byte, for example, as you realize, since you're not using a static, no matter how many times you're doing the count, it still refers to 1 because them automatically reset the value to be 0. So in this demonstration, you saw how to take advantage of the static variable. So you couldn't use a static function or a static subroutine anymore. You had to actually specify it per variable routine. In regard to returning a value from a function, as I mentioned, you could specify the name of the function. In order to return the value in VB.NET, you could still use the name function, or you could use the return keyword and basically return the value. Return statement exits the function immediately and returns to the value of the calling procedure. So be careful when you use the return keyword within your function. Using default properties in VB6, you could basically specify a default property for an object, and using the set to determine whether the assignment is referring to the object or a default property. In VB.NET, default properties is only available for parameterized properties. You cannot actually differentiate between object and default property assignments. So in this scenario, you have to declare a specific property for a specific object. You can't just rely on a default property. Also, the default properties are commonly used to index into the collections in VB.NET. So we are not really using default properties throughout the rest of our programming concept. As you see, you could call the default property only if the property takes parameter, as we talked about in VB.NET. In this scenario, we are declaring a record set. If you recall, part of ADO topic in VB6, we had ADODB library, and you could create an instance of a record set object. And in here, record set had a collection of fields, and each field's collection had a collection of available items. You could refer to a first field and get the value for it, as you see in here. This is valid. Also, you could specify the default property. If you remember, part of VB 6.0, you could specify the default property of the first field. But in this scenario, you couldn't specify the default property value, for example, in order to assign that, because this is not valid anymore. You have to declare the exact property in VB.NET. So this code, it belongs to VB.NET. In VB6, these two were valid, but now in VB.NET, these two specific lines of code are not available anymore. If you recall, label also had a property called text or caption in VB6. You could specify label equal to whatever value, and you didn't have to specify the caption. Now here you have to specify the text or perhaps the caption in VB6. You have to specify the actual property in order to set the value to it. You have a lab in which allows you to go and work with variables and procedures. This lab perhaps takes you a few minutes. I give you some time to finish this lab.